Without further ado, today I'm going to talk about Ktor, which is a Kotlin web framework designed for building web applications and services. Today I want to give you a pragmatic overview of what to expect when using Ktor and whether it really does deliver on its promise of better effectivity or productivity from the developer's point of view, and also performance. What really does that? And this is to share my limited experience when using this framework, mostly for hobby projects, but nevertheless I will try to explain. So my talk comprises 4 sections. After the brief introduction, I will talk about some core features, and then after that we zoom in onto how to leverage Ktor for building RESTful APIs, and we will have a closer look at using the routing, DSL, and serialization. And finally, in the last part of my talk, I will touch upon performance aspects, where we will glance over a brief benchmark and then have some thoughts about performance. All right, so what is Ktor and why should you care? Well, I guess most of you, and myself included, we use frameworks like Spring Boot, which has been around for 20 years and is fine-tuned for reliable. But sometimes you want to try something different, and Ktor is, sorry, oh, it's the wrong button. Ktor is essentially like minimalistic web framework, minimalistic compared to Spring Boot. It's still JVM, so compared to Rust, for example, it can still come across as bulky. But compared to bigger frameworks, it's a small, flexible, lightweight framework designed for the job of building, for quickly building RESTful APIs, web services. But not just that, you can also use it for a range of other use cases. You can use it both on the server side, you can also use it as an HTTP client. And the main premise of Ktor is that it supports asynchronous programming out of the box, and it uses non-blocking I/O, and combined with higher productivity because it's easy to learn and there is really low learning curve. This is the punchline from the documentation, more or less. So they say that it's suitable for building connected apps in an asynchronous way. So I think the main idea when JetBrains built this tool was the world is complex, let's have something simple that's easy to use so that you can connect different services together, build, spin up API of your own, and interpret the data the way you want. So I guess that must have been the initial thought. And I think overall, Ktor has been doing well, delivering on this message. So in short, before we delve into details, here's what to expect. So on the advantages of using Ktor, obviously it is fairly well suited for building server-side applications. You can also use it for writing chat applications, thanks to its support of WebSocket technology. Or you can use something more exotic, such as building a GraphQL server. Because you will notice throughout my talk that Ktor has this concept of using different plugins. So essentially, there are plugins for a lot of things, and GraphQL, for instance, is one of them. Some of the drawbacks, especially for you who maybe have been used to Java a lot and you really like Spring Boot's or Spring's dependency injection principle. So there is no such thing as dependency injection in Ktor. It's simple. And therefore you need to do all the wiring pretty much yourself. There are less ready-to-use features. What I mean is, yes, there is a wide variety of plugins you can use, but be ready to build on top of them. They're not essentially, they might not be production ready, or they might not be fully fleshed out. So, but you can use them as a base for your code. And then ultimately, the community is somewhat smaller, I would say. The community is fairly active. a lot is going on. You can expect a lot of support, but should you use Ktor for like production purposes, then if you come across like difficulties or some more advanced issues, that it might take you a while to find the right answer. So main features or the core features. I was reading documentation and watching videos, experimenting with it, and I really think it boils down to these things. It's supposed to be easy. It should deliver the promise that you as a developer, you should be productive, like, instantly. In developers world means like you spend an afternoon learning the tool and then you maybe try to write something in it. It's lightweight, so it's highly modular. There's like a minimalistic core dependency, and then you can add more as you need. And then obviously it's asynchronous and uses non-blocking I/O. That's like out of the box, so that you don't have to think about it. You just use the framework and it behaves that way. And then because it's suited for building primarily web applications, there is a rich routing API or DSL you can leverage to quickly build your API. So addressing these points, so first of all, ease of use. This section here, the main method, I can now use this. This shows how you can spin up a HTTP server. In this case, I chose to hard code all the documentation, but I could have loaded it from a config file as well. And this output here is the console, so that's what you would expect. It starts a server on the specified port. Now, if you have a look at this section, here, this is the configuration. So unlike Spring, which I will quickly compare it to in a minute, it uses this DSL where you can, in the first instance, I am defining some basic route, some hello world endpoint, and then here I'm installing a plugin. So call login is an additional dependency I have installed or I have specified, and then I'm installing it. And what it does for me is that whenever I hit this endpoint here, it will print out the route and also the time it took for the server to respond. So if I compare it to Spring Boot, the bootstrapping, it's not looking too bad. You can immediately spot the difference where Spring obviously relies on annotations as opposed to DSL. Nothing wrong with that. It's just a different approach. But then if I want to add the extra login, I need to write a filter. And then, spend quite some, or write quite a lot of boilerplate code to be able to get this, the same output, arrive at the same result. So whenever I hit my endpoint, get hello world endpoint, this is what it does for me. But I had to write a filter. Whereas in Ktor, if I go back, I just use this install and I'm done. Well, obviously, this is not to say that Spring is worse off or Ktor is so much better. It's just an example of the philosophy behind Ktor, that you can install a small plugin and then it does useful stuff for you. Whereas in Spring, you might not necessarily have that, but then you have other features like production ready end-to-end. Now, my next point is whether Ktor is lightweight. So both Spring and Ktor, they have this website when you can generate the project for you. So what I did, I went to start Ktor.io and just asked it to generate the default project without any extra dependencies. The only dependency I added was this server call login, which is the plugin I showed before. Now, when I compiled the jar, executable jar, it had 14 megabytes. Well, not too bad for a JVM application. Now, I did the same with Spring. So I went to start Spring.io and then asked it for the same job, give me a default project. But to make it comparable, because asynchronous and stuff like that, I opted for Webflux and Kotlin. So that added a little bit of extra dependencies. And then when I compiled the same jar, it was twice the size of the Ktor's project. It's not a completely fair comparison, but I think, again, I hope that it shows that Ktor is trying to be lean by default. And whichever dependencies or whichever features you want on top, there is a plugin for that. Now, the next point is asynchronous processing. So for this one, I actually wanted to show some code. I think it's going to be easier. The example I chose is a simple echo server. I chose echo server because I wanted to prove that Ktor is not just for writing HTTP applications. You can use it with, say, raw TCP or TCP sockets. There is a plugin for that. It's called Ktor Network. But once you install it, you can do that. So what I have here is a simple echo server. I'll explain what it does, but maybe I'll first show you what it does. So if I start it, it will start a server on this port. Then I can go to the console, and then I connect via telnet. Immediately you can see I get this prompt, enter your message, which also, and on the server side, I can see that it has accepted my connection from the connected client. Now, if I say hi, it echoes it back. It's an echo server, right? Hi there. Echoes it back again. It also prints it out to the console for me. And then when I am done, when I'm tired of this conversation, I just close the connection and it'll make sure that the socket is closed. So if I go through the code now, so just by the virtue of installing that network plugin, I'm able to create a server socket on this line using the framework's DSL. Now, this runs on the main thread. Now, in this infinite loop, I'm busy waiting for connecting clients, where I'm hoping to get access to the socket, which is like connection coming from the client. This accept method is, as you can see, suspendable, meaning that if there is a connection, it will return it, or it will suspend if there is none. So once I get the connection, I'm able to, because it's Kotlin, right? I can use coroutines to launch it on a different thread pool so that I don't block the main thread. So now in this designated thread pool, which we can see the communication from the client is indeed coming from a different thread, but the main. In this different thread pool, I handle the communication with the client in the following way. To be able to communicate with the client, I need the read channel, which reads the input from sent by client, the requests, and the write channel to write back to the client console. And these two methods here, they use an object that provides like non-blocking I/O. So this is supposed to be very efficient, not blocking the resources. And then the rest is pretty much what you would expect, just communication with the client, using the two channels to read and write, and then ultimately closing the socket when the client is done connecting. So that's that. So this was an example of using Ktor for something less stereotypical, like TCP. Why not? You can. It's probably not the most typically used case, but you can use it. And then the next part is, obviously, what you absolutely would want to use Ktor for is building HTTP APIs. It has the rich routing DSL. This whole thing is essentially a definition of an API that talks about customers. So I'm able to define a route, like a root route, customers. And then within that route, I have then different endpoints. This get endpoint accepts optional customer ID, optional path parameter. And then inside of that block, I have access to the call object, which essentially is like HTTP request, and it's able to process, for instance, the input parameters and handle missing information, or it's able to also call a service which I can inject and then again handle the outcome. And if it's a happy day scenario, I will ask in trying to find a customer by ID. I will get that customer and then I respond with that entity. However, there is no return value in Ktor. It's all side effects on the call object. So the call object behind the scenes, it generates the response, but you don't need to concern yourself as a developer with returning a value from your DSL. You know, this DSL thing, it's both blessing and a curse. I've seen people who absolutely dread it, they don't like it because it's really hard to understand if you try to think about how it works. But on the other hand, it's like quite convenient to use. So choose your standpoint, and if you're on the side that you actually opt for productivity without thinking too much how it works behind the scene, then you're fine. If you are like in the other group, then this might frustrate you. So it's a slightly different approach to what you may be used from using Spring, for example. Now, the big part of working with HTTP APIs is serialization. As you're sending objects across the wire, they need to be serialized from Java objects to, or Kotlin objects to JSON, etc. So Ktor offers several options. It has this default Ktor serialization module or plugin that you can use. Then you annotate your data classes, your business classes with it, and you are fine for the most part, because some objects, they don't lend themselves well to serialization. So, and you will come across this issue in production applications where you're just not dealing with primitives. But here, for instance, I wanted to represent price using big decimal. Big decimal is not serializable. So I had to write a custom serializer for it. Now, that's common to any serialization library, but some libraries are better than others. And I would have to say that Ktor's serialization option or plugin works, but maybe you would prefer something like Jackson or JSON or JSON, and you can. There are plugins for that too. So Ktor gives you options of when you want something, you typically have more than one way of doing it. So you could choose, you could plug in a different technology and use that instead. All right, this brings me to the second and last of my demos. I just wanted to show you more details about the server, the HTTP server. So what I wanted to show here is basically just a few things. First of all, how to even write an application in Ktor without, say, dependency injection. And the answer is that if you have a look at the main application, similar to what you would do in Spring, there's this main method, and then here's the configuration. So because it is Kotlin, obviously, it will use some of the features of Kotlin. So a common pattern I noticed is that you use a lot of extension methods. So this application object is something provided by the framework, and then you can extend it to, for instance, install serialization plugin and say everything I return is JSON. And then you can configure routing, and because each of the routes might be quite, lengthy and complicated, then you can again split it up and nest it. So my customer route, there's a designated file just for that, for all the endpoints that are to do with the customer API. Similarly, the same for my order routes. They're in a designated file. So that way you break down the complexity by like infinite nesting. Again, it's a pattern, and when using Ktor, you might like it or you might not like it, but that's typically how people go about complicated setup. And when it comes to dependency injection, you see this is a little bit of a pitfall or downside of using Ktor. In my example here, it was fairly simple to just instantiate, customer surveys or order surveys because they take no other dependencies. But in a real-world project, I would typically have to provide like an instance of an HTTP client, which I would have to configure somewhere. So it would get a bit more complex, more involved. But that's how you do DI. You just plug it in yourself, and then within your router, then you have the service available as a dependency, and you can use it for doing the business stuff. Now the serialization, I briefly mentioned the custom serializer. So my customer data class is fine. There's nothing to write home about. But the order item, that's where it takes a non-serializable class, and that's how the serializer looks like. So Ktor equips me with like simple interface where I can just quickly declare how to serialize, deserialize. This is not production ready, by the way, because I should handle exceptions. But yeah, so that's how it works. Any plugins you use, you typically use plugins package for that, so that you keep things neatly organized. So these were quick 2 demos just to show you the feel of what it is like to work with Ktor. And now I would move on to talking about performance aspects. Because when you read about Ktor, you hear a lot about how performant it is because it's asynchronous and it's non-blocking under the hood. But is it really the case? So what I did, again, I did a quick test where I had this default project I showed before, and then had this one route, hello world route, in Ktor, and I did the same with Spring Boot Webflux. So head-to-head, and then I used Apache Bench as a benchmarking tool. Maybe you're more familiar with tools like JMeter, but I found it a bit too cumbersome for the simple demo, so I just chose AB. Was way simple to install and use. In my test, I load 1,000 requests, and then 100 of them run concurrently, and I hit my start by server. I hit this endpoint with a random string representing the name, and I repeated it n times and got some results out of it. So if I take a look at the results, with Ktor, obviously the request rates were quite high. I was able to achieve seemingly good performance, almost 20K requests per second. The average or mean response time was 5 milliseconds. But if I have a look at the percentage over how the response times were spread out, you can see that even though 50% of my traffic was sub 5 milliseconds, then there were some outliers. There were some slowdowns, and that's interesting. With Spring Boot, I was actually able to hit almost 21,000K, and my mean time was under 5 milliseconds. And if I have a look at the spread, you can see it was consistent. Spring Boot was able to consistently keep the same response time. So what does it say? Well, it doesn't say much because it's like for very simplistic test. It doesn't have much of a value. But maybe my point is that Ktor is not a silver bullet just because it's asynchronous. You still need to adjust it to your use case. You still need to know, what to expect, what load, and pretty much what Jirka was talking about, that you should try to estimate, your use case or the load, and then justify using the right tool for the job. So in some cases, Ktor might be a good fit, in other cases, not so much. If you want a more thorough comparison, I took time to read through some articles and compiled a list at the end of the presentation. There are 2 articles that are particularly good and that compare Ktor to not only JVM frameworks, but also Rust frameworks. And it wasn't too bad for Ktor, so I think it's an interesting read. Their setup was way more advanced and they were more focused and had way more metrics in place, so you can have a look at that. So then, almost at the end of the talk, asking yourself a question then, should I use Ktor? Well, there are obviously advantages and concerns. So advantages, I hope at this point it's clear, Ktor really is quick to learn and easy to use, especially for someone who has strong Kotlin background. It's asynchronous out of the box and it's easy to configure. That's definitely a benefit. It has flexible routing DSL and it has a variety of HTTP engines you can use for different purposes. So there is this CIO engine, which is like for coroutines, but you can also use Apache HTTP engine. You can use HTTP engine for JavaScript even, I believe. So there's a wide range of use cases and it's all swappable. So you can use different HTTP engines for different purposes. And then obviously concerns. So it's definitely not as mature as Spring Boot with 2 decades of production experience. Also, assume lower adoption. I actually struggled to find some data about adoption of Ktor. I couldn't get to any numbers. And then the community is smaller, even though it's very active, but you kind of need to be ready to roll up your sleeves and contribute if it needs to be. So then again, should you use it for real? And it would be silly of me if I said no, right? Wasting all your time in this talk. So obviously you should use Ktor. I would personally use it for building something less critical, like maybe lightweight APIs for like internal services. And then if your code is mostly Kotlin and coroutines, then Ktor is very much a natural fit. You don't need to do much to adopt it. And if your priority is low learning curve and high productivity, then definitely it's a good choice. Be careful if you need enterprise-grade backend. That's not, I don't think that's at the moment the case for Ktor. When you need many reliable integrations out of the box, like Kafka or queuing systems and stuff like that, I'm not sure if Ktor would be the good fit. Or if your team has ever invested into Spring and Java. So there's also this mental thing that some people like the Java approach, and there's nothing wrong with that. So switching from something like Java beans to Kotlin DSL might be a little bit too much for some people. So consider that as well. Anyway, thanks for your patience and time. And now it's time for questions. Before I wrap it up, just next slide. Here are the articles I was talking about. I promise they won't be a waste of your time, so you can read through them. All right, thank you.
Psaní testů na Ktor a hlavně jako integrační.
Velmi dobrý. Vlastně Ktor, nevím, jestli má sám o sobě nějaký testovací framework, ale můžeš používat třeba code test, který má podobnou filozofii DSL na testy, nebo můžeš použít JUnit 5. Takže vlastně testy pro Ktor nejsou žádná překážka. Když jsem mluvil o těch routách, vlastně, že to nic nevrací, tak tam je to spíš na integrační testy a tam samozřejmě se pak ta implementace stává tak trošku black box, protože prostě nastartuješ server, hitneš nějaký endpoint a koukáš na response, nekoukáš moc na logiku. Ale pro unit testy velmi dobře se píšou pro Ktor.
Jak jsi zmiňoval chybějící dependency injection, zkoušel jsi třeba coin, jak to funguje s tím, nebo nějaký jiný?
Neskoušel a to je zase moje limitace, protože vlastně s Ktorem jsem tolik produkčního kódu nenapsal. ale děkuju za poznámku, podívám se. Srovnával jsem to s frameworkama typu třeba Javelin, ten myslím dependency injection má, ale tam se mi zase úplně nelíbila ta hodně taková ta javovská, těžkopádná syntaxe, kdy oni mají třeba jako perfektní APIčko kolem requestu, může se zeptat úplně na cokoliv a prostě vrátí ti to informace o tom requestu, ale ta produktivita se mi zdá výrazně nižší, ale děkuju, podívám se na Kotlin.
Tak ještě dotaz dám.
Určitě, jasně.
Mám dotaz, jaký vlastně ORMka existují pro Ktor? Jestli vůbec existují.
Jo, to je dobrý point, no. To je taky neprobádané pole z mého pohledu. S Hibernatem bych to asi neskoušel. Ale určitě nějaký databázová integrace tam bude. Já jsem spíš používal Ktor na psaní HTTP klientů a nebo prostě jenom provolávání nějakých externích servis, takže tu zkušenost s tím úplně nemám, ale jsou na to pluginy, no. Start Ktor.io a zkusit tam něco najít.
Já můžu ještě tak doplnit ty dependency injection, tak mám zkušenost s integrací s Kotlinem a nahradí to Spring dependency injection z nápadní.
Jo, perfekt. A dá se zkombinovat s Ktorem.
Jo.
Super, děkuju. Skvělý.
Tady už máme to sdílení těch
No.
zkušeností, to se mi hrozně líbí. Děkuji moc za 2,5 dotazů. Další dotazy určitě na to mám, můžete dát o přestávce nebo potom networkové části. Tome, ještě jednou díky za super přednášku v angličtině. Bylo to úžasné, ještě jednou prosím potlesk pro Toma.
Děkuji.